So thanks to everyone again, all the families for being here. That's wonderful. 20-odd years ago, I described these as the forgotten flyers of 1919, but today they're definitely not so forgotten. And a fading part of our history is a little bit brighter by these fine efforts. Thanks to everybody for being here today and making this event so wonderful. My association with you over the last 20 years has been made richer because of this. We have also Cyril Smith here today from Garden City, who is the keeper of the flame for the NC4 and all the historic aviation and other history of Garden City, which is quite full over that way and further east on Long Island. So yes, this crew of 6, led by Lieutenant Commander Buddy Reed, made the first crossing of any ocean by air. When German U-boats were sinking 1 million tons of shipping per month in the First World War, the Navy specified 4 large flying boats, that is, an aircraft that can only land or take off from the water, to be built by Curtiss Airplane and Motor Company and the Navy. These airplanes were unique in that they were commissioned as if they were ships. They had commanding officers, commissioning pennants, and it's a unique distinction they only share with the Navy's large dirigibles of the 20s and 30s. Now let's go back in time 100 years. Today, May 8, 1919, the NC4 is only a week old, and it only has 5 hours of flying time. Let that sink in for a second. Departing for the very first flight across an entire ocean, the airplane's been tested for 5 hours. So these crews were quite intrepid. I don't know if today we would take those same chances. Too soon, one of the NC4's engines starts having problems and they shut it down. So they're flying on 3 as they're passing the coast of Massachusetts. Another engine throws a connecting rod and they have to land at Chatham Naval Air Station. But they don't land at the air station, they land 100 miles out in the ocean, and they taxi for an entire night in order to get to Chatham by morning, where they can have their aircraft repaired. So this leads to the good ship NC4 being nicknamed the lame duck by the other crews, in the typical humor of the sea services. That said, these engines have triple the life of the airplane engine of just a couple years before. Still, each of these Liberty 12s will need a complete top-to-bottom overhaul at about 75 hours of flying time. They'll only need about 50 hours across the ocean, so plenty of margin for error, right? So on the morning of May 8th, they take off, with Trapassi, Newfoundland as the intermediate refueling stop prior to their attempt at the hop across the ocean. Bad weather at Trapassi causes further delay, and Commander John Towers, the expedition's leader and skipper, is itching to go on without the NC4. They actually try the NC1 and 3 on the 15th, but both of them are overloaded with fuel because the 1 and 3 crews do not know that the gauges don't read properly, but the NC4 crews do. This allows the NC4 to catch up, and finally all 3 depart on the longest leg on Friday evening, May 16th. They have to fly overnight to get to the Azores, so they'll arrive in the daytime because of the state of navigation in those days. As the park superintendent said, down the ocean there's dozens of Navy ships lined up along the legs of the route. And they did quite a job at pointing the way and trying to assist the crews. So for flying conditions, we're sitting at the controls, exposed to the elements, in an unheated cockpit. We have only goggles, a leather helmet, a leather flying suit, maybe some extra underwear, a tiny windshield, about this big, to protect you from wind, rain, birds, other various hazards of flying in an open cockpit. You're buffeted by relative winds of 100 to 125 miles an hour, flying at an average of 70 to 80 miles an hour ground speed for hours on end. Every time the control surfaces are hit by a strong gust, it very directly affects the pilots. It takes both of the pilots to hold the aircraft steady. In the days before true instrument flying, these crews have to keep constant visual contact with the surface of the ocean to maintain their orientation. In fact, at one point, the NC4 thinks they're flying straight and level. They suddenly find they're in a steep bank when they get a sighting on the water and yank it back to level. And this is due to dense clouds and fog. As someone said at the time, instrument flying in the NC almost meant flying without instruments. As the clock runs on, the lame duck motors by overhead. On the surface, having landed to get their bearings, the other 2 NCs are unable to take off again. There are high seas cresting 20 to 30 feet, and the other 2 NCs are unable to take off. NC1, its crew is rescued by a Greek freighter, the Ionia. Luckily, they sink the aircraft after they take it in tow. It doesn't stay upright. Landing a couple hours later, and in a formidable story that make a movie all its own, The NC-3 sails and taxis, but mostly sails with Commander Towers aboard as commander, backwards no less, nearly 250 miles to the Azores. And they're lost for 2 days. Nobody knows where they are. They think they're gone. They have a man standing out at each wingtip trying to keep the aircraft from capsizing because both the wingtip floats have broken off. So that's an incredible story. The scheduled fuel stop in the Azores takes more than 17 hours to reach from Newfoundland. And after what seems like interminable delays, weather, engine repairs, other problems, NC-4, as you know, finally makes Lisbon, Portugal on May 27th. A few days later, she flies on to Plymouth, England, and in an echo of our country's early history, she lands there exactly 299 years to the day after the Mayflower's departure for America. The elapsed flying time for the entire crossing from Rockaway to Lisbon and on to Plymouth adds up to more than 51.5 hours. That's a slow way to go. Restored by the Smithsonian Air Museum and the Navy for her 50th anniversary in 1969, almost entirely thanks to the foresight of the late NASM curator Dr. Paul E. Garber, who during his 50-year tenure shepherded the NC-4's remains from 1927, brought them together from various naval air stations around the country 30 years later, and had to wait another 12 years to restore the aircraft to save it. And of course today it's the crown jewel of the center of the National Museum of Naval Aviation. Thanks again everyone for coming out today, and thank you very much for your time.
Good morning. My name is Carrie Towers, and I'm one of Jack Towers' great-granddaughters. Aviation has been consistently part of our family since Jack Towers started flying in 1911 in Hammondsport, New York, with Glenn Curtis. We now stand at 4 generations of pilots, and going for a 5th. We have a few young ones that we're hoping for. Our history is a little more diverse in that we had some Pan Am pilots. We have an Air Force, a grandfather who was an Air Force pilot. Then my grandfather who was an instructor in the Navy. My father went on to fly for Eastern Airlines, also a seaplane pilot. I was an airline pilot along with the corporate pilot. And we have Will here who flies now for JetBlue. We feel very proud that we are keeping the legacy going for Jack Towers. I decided to pursue aviation for the fun and the travel excitement and not to have a real job. It wasn't until I got my first airline job in my mid-20s that I started to understand who Jack Towers was and what this mission was. We had a wonderful grandparents who would share stories of Jack Towers and sort of the personal stories we heard, but there was never a, you must go be a pilot. There was never pressure there. But as I started to fly professionally, I would get teamed up with Navy pilots and Air Force pilots, and we'd introduce ourselves in the cockpit, and they'd say, Carrie Towers, any relation to Jack Towers? And I looked at them, how? Yes, and I started to understand who he was when you start to care a little more, when you're a little bit older than just a kid growing up in a family like that. So I then started to gain an appreciation as I studied about what happened here and comparing the primitive ways of flight that these men had to deal with and the luxury that we had. Thinking about navigation, their boats and lights and no VORs and no GPS, and really just, you know, looking at the ships and the lights and navigating that way. Then just thinking about weather reporting. We had weather reports come right into the cockpit on the FMS. Everything was easy. We knew when. We had radar. They didn't have radar. So I started to gain confidence just when I would come into troubles with thunderstorms, snowstorms, landing gear issues, things that seemed scary in the early days of my career. And then I'd always go back to these men and this mission and what they had to endure. Even a maintenance problem. If you had a small minor maintenance issue, you call maintenance, there's paperwork, there's a process, where these guys did not have anything but themselves to fix the problem. Nobody was signing off on it. The 5 hours of test flying before this mission is unbelievable to me. The navigating by a sextant is unbelievable to me. I know Many people have done it, but became very spoiled. So I got a lot of appreciation and confidence, actually, through thinking I was brave, but really thinking about all these men that was brave and what they accomplished. Soloing an airplane, anyone who's got their pilot's license here, every single person remembers the first time they soloed an airplane. And reading about Jack when he was with Glenn Curtis, his first day of flight training, he essentially soloed an airplane, which meant there wasn't another seat. He just went up and he tried and actually crashed and shattered his ankle, but then he kept going. The reason he did that was because Ellison, who hopped in the cockpit before, weighed 25 pounds more than Jack Towers. So they forgot to talk about that. So when Jack Towers got in, he zoomed right up and sort of lost control of the airplane based on weight, because the plane was only 500 pounds. I then related that I had the similar experience as I'm sure many of you had. My flight instructor was 220 pounds, and at the time I was 115 pounds. The first day I soloed, he got out and said, "Good luck, you've got it." And it was in Burlington, Vermont, and I zoomed up, busted my pattern altitude, couldn't figure out what was going on, and we forgot to talk about that. So I feel connected we're all going through it at different periods, but back then was just another scenario altogether that was brave and inspiring. And so being here 100 years later, it's incredible to see how far aviation has come. We're honored to be here today to remember the heroic achievements of everyone involved in the first across Atlantic mission. These men were at the forefront of a new frontier to explore. I think aviation has filled in nicely, but one part, looking at all the young kids here, that needs a little more attention is the lack of women pilots that we have today. So right now my research shows between 4 and 6% of all pilots are women in the US, commercial pilots. I think we can do better than that, and it's a wonderful career for any of the young kids, boys and girls, thinking about what to do. It's just a decision to do it. It's exciting, the pay is wonderful, we're coming into a pilot shortage, and it would be nice to see if we can fill in the gap there. And finally, thank you to Robbie, for all of his hard work and passion which created this event today. Also to the history connectors, primarily my grandparents, Charlie and Lois Towers, and Lois, who passed away last week. She was the force and a wonderful storyteller, and she was the one who has kept it alive in our family. Howie Loudon is a big supporter of the NC flight and of Jack Towers, and the late Clark Reynolds. Thank you all, and here's Will.
Hi. Well, Terry, you mostly hit everything on the seatbelt story. Since I see a lot of kids here, I want to share with this story from Jack himself when he was first getting into aviation. And I think as an aviator, all of us can relate to resistance when we first decide to become a pilot, or anything else for that matter. I was a young officer in the first dreadnought of the fleet around 1910, very interested in gunnery. And I found out that the ordnance had outgrown the ability of the personnel to use it, and that it fired over the horizon. We couldn't get it high enough in the ship to see where the shots hit. That frankly was the beginning of my interest in aviation. The Navy was a very conservative outfit at the time I joined the fleet after graduation from Annapolis. Skipping ahead. When I began to show an interest in aviation, I was advised by my seniors to be awfully careful because my officer had ruined his record by trying to be a little too progressive. Pretty much building what Kerry said, that you're going to see a lot of resistance, even on simple things like the seatbelt on the NC-4. I know Jack lost his pilot, I guess he was the passenger, because of turbulence. There was no seatbelts involved. So basically, building with what Carrie said here, a lot of resistance in the field of aviation, but with all the kids here and stuff, it is a great career. Thank you.
Park Service to put this together. Dave Knapp, Lima Malawi, Lynn Hollowell,